There's a moment in the spring of 1204 that no one who witnessed it ever forgot, and no one who studies it ever quite recovers from, because what happened in those 3 days in April was not a battle between enemies. It was not a clash between civilizations that had spent centuries sharpening their hatred against each other. It was something far darker and far more difficult to explain away. It was the moment that an army of Christian knights, men who had sewn crosses onto their mantles and taken sacred oaths before God to liberate Jerusalem, turned their swords and their torches on the greatest Christian city on earth, and burned it, and looted it, and killed its people in the streets, and called it the Will of Heaven. And that city was Constantinople, the queen of cities, the jewel of the ancient world, the living heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, a metropolis of 500,000 souls whose libraries contained the accumulated knowledge of Greece and Rome, whose churches dripped with gold accumulated across 9 centuries of imperial power, whose walls had held back Persians, and Arabs and Bulgars and Rus raiders and every force that the ancient world could throw against them, walls that had never been breached by a foreign enemy in the 900 years since Constantine had laid the first stone. And in 72 hours, a ragged, debt-ridden, politically manipulated army of Western Crusaders did what no enemy in 9 centuries had managed to do. They broke through, and what they did next would fracture the Christian world so completely, so permanently, so catastrophically, that the wound has never fully healed, not in 800 years, not even today. And this is the story of that fracture. This is the story of the Latin Empire of Constantinople, one of the most shameful, most consequential, and most deliberately forgotten episodes in the entire history of Western civilization. And the question you need to hold in your mind from this moment forward is not merely how it happened, because the how is complicated and ugly and deeply human. The question is why, centuries later, we still cannot bring ourselves to look at it directly, why the history books of the West treat it as a footnote rather than the civilizational catastrophe it actually was, and whether the silence itself tells us something about who we are and what we choose to remember and what we choose to bury. To understand what was destroyed in 1204, you have to understand what Constantinople was, not as a postcard, not as a symbol, but as a living organism, a city that breathed and thought and remembered in ways that the Western European world of the early 13th century could barely comprehend. Because while Western Europe had spent the centuries after the fall of Rome in what historians politely call a period of reorganization, while Charlemagne's scholars were painstakingly relearning Latin grammar and English monks were copying manuscripts by candlelight in drafty stone rooms, Constantinople had never stopped. It had kept the libraries of Alexandria's intellectual tradition alive in new forms. It had maintained a bureaucratic and legal apparatus descended directly from imperial Rome. It had produced theological scholarship of staggering sophistication, and it had accumulated a physical wealth in art, in relics and manuscripts, in gold and ivory and silk and porphyry, that made the richest city in Western Europe look like a market town. And the relationship between this city and the crusading West was not a relationship between equals. It was a relationship between an ancient and somewhat contemptuous grandmother and a loud, ambitious, not entirely civilized grandchild who had recently discovered that he was stronger than she was, and that tension, the combination of Byzantine cultural condescension and Western military restlessness and economic hunger, had been building for more than a century before 1204, poisoned further by the Great Schism of 1054, when the Catholic and Orthodox churches had excommunicated each other in a theological quarrel over the precise wording of a single clause in the Nicene Creed, a quarrel that sounds almost absurdly technical, until you understand that in the medieval world, theology was politics and politics was theology, and there was no meaningful boundary between the two. And into this already combustible landscape, in the year 1202, a new crusade was launched, the Fourth Crusade, officially aimed at Egypt, the strategic heart of Islamic power in the region, and it was supposed to be a clean, purposeful military operation. And it became instead one of the most spectacular and consequential train wrecks in the history of organized religion. What happened between 1202 and 1204 is a story of debt and manipulation and mission creep, and a Byzantine prince with a desperate gamble that went catastrophically wrong. It begins on the island of Zara on the Adriatic coast, where the crusading army, massively in debt to the Venetian Republic for the ships that were supposed to carry them to Egypt, agreed under enormous pressure to attack and sack a Christian city, Zara, which was Catholic, which was under the protection of the King of Hungary, who was himself a crusader, and Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire army for it, the entire crusading force, every knight and soldier and priest excommunicated, and they kept going because the logic of debt and momentum had taken over from the logic of faith. And then came the prince, Alexios Angelus, a young Byzantine claimant whose father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup, And Alexios arrived at the Crusader camp with an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. "Help me take back Constantinople," he said. "Help me restore my father to the throne, and I will reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches under Rome. I will pay off your debt to Venice. I will supply and fund the rest of your crusade to the Holy Land." It was an offer that solved every problem the crusading leadership faced, and it was an offer built on promises that Alexios had absolutely no realistic ability to keep. And the Crusaders took it, and in the summer of 1203, the fleet appeared before the walls of Constantinople, and the city, that had never been taken from the sea, looked out from its towers at the largest crusading fleet ever assembled. And for a moment, everything teetered. And then the incumbent emperor fled, and Alexios' father was restored, and the Crusaders waited outside the walls for their payment, a payment that never came, because the Byzantine population had turned violently against Alexios for making promises to Latins that were theologically and politically unacceptable. And Alexios was strangled in a palace coup, and a new emperor took power who told the Crusaders he owed them nothing. And the army outside the walls, broke and excommunicated and furious, made a decision that would echo through 8 centuries of history. They attacked. Now comes the part that the celebratory histories of the Crusades tend to skip over quickly, the part that requires us to sit in the discomfort of what actually happened inside the walls of Constantinople in April of 1204. Because the sack lasted 3 days, and in those 3 days, things occurred that the Crusaders' own chroniclers recorded with a mixture of justification and unease that tells you they knew, on some level, that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The churches were stripped, the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the Christian world, the building that the Emperor Justinian had consecrated in 537. Solomon was looted, its altar broken up for the silver, a prostitute placed on the patriarch's throne according to the Byzantine chronicler Niketas Choniates. Who was there? Who watched? Who fled the city with his family through streets running with blood? And who wrote about it with a grief and a rage that still burns off the page 8 centuries later. And Choniates makes a comparison that should stop every Western reader cold. He writes that the Muslims who had previously captured Jerusalem were more merciful than these Crusaders were to fellow Christians. And that is not the comparison of a propagandist. That is the comparison of an eyewitness trying to find language adequate to what he had seen. And the relics were stolen, the bones of saints and apostles and martyrs that Byzantium had spent centuries accumulating at enormous cost were loaded onto Venetian ships and distributed across Western Europe, where they still sit today in churches in Venice and Rome and Paris, objects of veneration in the West that are objects of grief and theft in the East. And the manuscripts were burned or used as kindling or simply lost, irreplaceable texts of ancient mathematics and philosophy and medicine that existed nowhere else on earth, gone. And then the Crusaders divided the empire among themselves. A Flemish count named Baldwin was crowned Emperor of Constantinople in the Hagia Sophia. Venetian merchants received trading privileges that effectively made them the economic masters of the new state. And the Latin Empire of Constantinople was born, a ghost empire. An empire built on stolen foundations that would stagger forward for 57 years before collapsing. But in those 57 years, it did something to the Christian world that no subsequent reconciliation has ever fully repaired. What remained after 1261, when the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople from the last Latin emperor, was a city hollowed out, a civilization that had been bled to its skeleton, a population perhaps a quarter of what it had been before 1204, an empire so weakened that when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II finally brought his cannons to the walls in 1453, the city that had held for 9 centuries against everything the ancient world could throw at it fell in a matter of weeks. And the historians who study this sequence argue, with considerable evidence, that without 1204, without the Latin sack that depleted the treasury and shattered the military and fractured the loyalty of the empire as subject peoples, 1453 might never have happened, or might have happened very differently, which means that the army of Western Crusaders who looted Constantinople in the name of Christ may have done more to end Christian rule in the Eastern Mediterranean than any Islamic army ever did. And that is not a comfortable sentence. It is not supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to make you stop and reckon with the gap between the stories civilizations tell about themselves and the things they actually do. And the Latin Empire's legacy is precisely that gap, made visible, made stone and bone and blood. And today the Orthodox and Catholic churches have not merged. The wound opened in 1054 and torn wide in 1204 remains. Pope John Paul II apologized in 2001 for the sack of Constantinople, a gesture that the ecumenical patriarch received with quiet acknowledgement, and which changed nothing structural about the divide between the two churches. And in an era when we speak endlessly about civilizational clashes between East and West, about Christianity and Islam, about sacred values and political interest. The Latin Empire of Constantinople stands as a monument to a different and perhaps more unsettling truth: that the most devastating blow a civilization can suffer is rarely the one that comes from the outside. It is the one that comes from within, from allies who became rivals, from brothers who became enemies, from men who convinced themselves that what they wanted and what God wanted were the same thing, and the great silent question that the ruins of Byzantium have been asking for 800 years, the question that the looted relics in their Western churches have been asking, the question that Niketas Choniates answered with his grief-soaked chronicle, and that no one in power has ever fully answered since, is simply this: when you destroy what you claim to protect, what does that make you, and what does it say about everything you say you believe?